Although The Vampire Diaries isn't an outrageously outdated show, there are undeniably many aspects of the series that haven't aged well and come across very poorly in retrospect. And one of the most bizarre and unsettling storylines that the show explored to an uncomfortable degree in season 1 was actually repeated, expanded upon, and shockingly made even worse in seasons 2 and 3. Damon Salvatore was clearly the major selling point for The Vampire Diaries from the very start, and he was an overtly antagonistic villain. But one of the least appealing aspects of his introduction in the TV series was the so-called relationship that he began with Caroline Forbes right off the bat. While it was only a little more than 10 years ago that The Vampire Diaries first premiered, it's obvious based on some of its contemporaries on the CW that the perception of this forced relationship and sexual storyline wasn't viewed the same way then that it would be today. For instance, in the first episode of Gossip Girl, Chuck Bass attempts to violate Jenny Humphrey. And yet, by the time the show comes to its conclusion, Chuck is an undeniable protagonist. However, what distinguished Damon's storyline with Caroline is that instead of acknowledging what was actually going on between them, and how gross it really was, the show attempted to rebut the claim that this was somehow abusive, and actually doubled down on its fuckery. The Vampire Diaries was clearly trying to embrace its legitimate horror genre elements, with Caroline and Damon's first serious encounter. But it's hard to ignore what a profoundly disturbing sequence it really is. Caroline waking up in bed, afraid and attempting to sneak away, only to be caught by Damon, thrown back onto the bed, and attacked once again, is a horror show in a way that TVD clearly didn't intend it to be. For a modern viewer, there really wouldn't be any question about what was going on here. And although the interpretation of these storylines were apparently more acceptable when the show first began airing, it's not as if there wasn't a significant subsection of the Vampire Diaries fandom that were very quick to point out that what was actually on display here was criminally abusive. Unfortunately, the creators of the series clearly noticed this criticism, and they did not handle it well whatsoever. Despite the fact that the material they were presenting was pretty objectively and indisputably problematic, it seems that they simply thought that the audience was misunderstanding what was happening and misinterpreting Damon and Caroline's relationship. Obviously, coming to grips with the fact that you may have unintentionally written an abusive dynamic into your story is not a fun idea to confront. But the notion that everyone watching was just reading things wrong was extremely unsettling. And what made it much, much worse is that rather than trying to fix the problem, or even ever acknowledging that the problem existed, The Vampire Diaries doubled down and actually made Damon Salvatore's most horrific storyline even worse. Because, seemingly in response to the criticism that was levied towards the show, because of Damon's abuse of Caroline, the show decided to introduce one of its grossest storylines by putting Damon into another so-called relationship with Andie Starr. Unfortunately, Damon and Caroline's interactions were far from the only instances of characters being forced or coerced into sexual situations because of compulsion. But their interactions were an incredibly overt and unambiguous situation that the show really went overboard with in its debut season. Damon compelling, using, and abusing Caroline was a significant part of the story, which makes it stand out as exceptionally awful. But Andie Starr truly illustrated the fact that the writers not only couldn't understand what they had done wrong when it was outright explained to them, but they actually doubled down on the fuckery and made it even worse. The Vampire Diaries has a habit of treating its female characters in a not fantastic way. But Andie, and her compelled servitude to Damon, was truly repulsive. Not only does Andie have very little development outside of her supposed relationship with Damon, but despite the fact that he is literally using her for his own pleasure and convenience, the writers went out of their way to have Andie clarify that she would want to be with Damon regardless. It's not too difficult to read through the lines here and understand what the show was actually trying to convey. They looked at the completely justified criticism regarding Damon's behavior towards Caroline, and instead of recognizing what the issue was and trying to fix it, they tried to rewrite something objectively terrible into something slightly less terrible. In reality, they simply added insult to injury. When fans brought it to their attention that they had accidentally essentially wrote their leading heartthrob as a sex criminal, which is understandably a pretty big issue for a TV series aimed at teenage girls, they added in yet another storyline where Damon exploits a completely innocent stranger, but then tried to play it off as if she were somehow consenting, or would consent if she were actually given that option, which obviously is not how any of that actually works. And although Caroline's treatment at Damon's hands was absolutely abhorrent, the shred of silver lining is at the very least, Caroline was a character with relevance outside of her role as Damon's sex minion. And in the grand scheme of things, their weird interactions were relatively brief, and Caroline's character obviously developed far beyond that initial storyline. But what sucks is that the same obviously can't be said about Andie. Damon's thing with Andie is not okay for a lot of reasons. But what makes it all the more disturbing is that it seems obvious that her character's entire existence is purely driven by the need to diminish what kind of character they initially wrote Damon to be. She's largely there just to show that being Damon's mind-controlled servant is actually fun instead of scary as hell. And introducing characters as plot devices is bad writing under any circumstance. But introducing a character as a plot device designed to show that you actually didn't accidentally write your main character as someone who uses his magical powers to mentally enslave women and exploit them for his every whim desire is truly some epically messed up stuff. But regardless, Andie showed up and tried but failed to rewrite the history of Damon and Caroline. And once she had fully established that using mind control on someone in order for them to have sex with you isn't actually that crime we all know it is, she was killed off. Which was sad, because it made Damon sad. Again, The Vampire Diaries doesn't typically treat its female characters well, but it's really hard to get over the fact that they introduced this character solely to rehabilitate Damon's image when fans pointed out how outrageously fucked up one of his earlier storylines was. And then they fridged her, making the tragedy of her death entirely about Damon's fifis. And unsurprisingly, it didn't work. TVD tried to retcon its own massive mistake at first, and then just ignored it for the rest of the series, and acted as if Damon and Caroline had some humorous frenemies relationship that bordered on friendship for the rest of the show. That is, when they weren't having characters like Elena point out that Caroline was actually just easy and willing to jump into bed with him immediately, while completely ignoring the fact that she literally tried to flee for her life afterward. But despite their attempts to sweep it under the rug, many people, including Ian Somerhalder himself, continued to point out that what Damon did to Caroline was not remotely okay, and clearly not consensual. And unfortunately, it was far from the last time that the show had its vampire characters force unwanted relationships onto people through compulsion. But it was arguably the most memorable and most repulsive, simply due to the fact that the show doubled down on its own massive fail when they were called out on it. And that is how The Vampire Diaries took Damon Salvatore's worst storyline and actually managed to make it even shittier. Ironically, in their quest to prove that it wasn't actually that bad, or that the audience didn't understand what was really happening. But what do you think? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.